And it's evidential purposes for the copying back here for civil.
It's not very often that when I write a case, I can do it without a conscience, without a respect for either party. That being said, it's really not a refreshing change. I mean, where do we start? It said Caroline Kayll embarked on a career in helping other people from a young age. She first worked as a social worker, demonstrating a passion for supporting vulnerable individuals in her community. She later transitioned into law enforcement, serving for a time as a police officer in Cumbria, England. This period in policing gave her the experience in dealing with challenging social situations and likely developed skills in communication and in empathy. Her early career path established Caroline as a caring professional, committed to public welfare, a trait that colleagues and friends would remember throughout her life. After working in social services and policing, Caroline Kayll shifted into the prison service. That was in early 2000s. She took a job at HMP Northumberland, Her Majesty's Prison, a prison in the north of England, initially working as a prison officer and later as a prison education officer, basically a prison teacher teaching inmates. This role involved teaching and rehabilitative work with the prisoners, reflecting a continued dedication to helping others improve their lives. It was at HMP Northumberland in 2002 that Caroline, as a prison officer, met Ian. Ian was a senior prison officer and security manager at the prison. The two developed a relationship and eventually married 3 years later in 2005. During this period, she balanced her professional life in the prison with her new life as a wife. Colleagues later noted that she was respected in her role. She had smoothly transitioned from security duties to educational positions behind the prison, indicating her adaptability and commitment to inmate education. Caroline's marriage to Ian was apparently an important part of her personal life. By all accounts, the couple had a strong bond during their years together. Even after they separated, they remained on good terms, meeting up every few weeks. Friends would later describe Caroline as someone who tried to handle personal matters with grace and discretion. Discretion indeed. I mean, Caroline seems great so far, right? But I'm afraid this is where a lot of people are going to fall out with me, and I'm probably going to get some abuse because I have to say how it is. Ironically, this would be a great time to do the disclaimers. So please do remember, this is a true crime case. It's a real story involving real people. Those real people have real families and real friends. So although I do want you to share and I do want you to comment, please do so with sensitivity. A fateful chapter in Caroline's life began through her work at the prison. So let's go back to 2005. She was newly married to Ian and now working as a prison education officer. It was now that Caroline met Paul Robson. Paul was serving as an inmate at HMP Northumberland. Immorally and actually illegally, they formed a clandestine, secretly illicit relationship. Paul Thomas Robson was 3 years older than Caroline. He grew up in the northeast of England and he went to Washington Boys School. When he left, he became an apprentice painter and decorator. He also did labouring with fish, but at some point he became quite a naughty boy. By his early 20s, he'd started a pattern of criminal behaviour that would persist throughout his adult life. Over the next few decades, Paul amassed 21 convictions with 92 offences. By all accounts, he was a career criminal. His record includes numerous violent and drug-related crimes. A few examples of these convictions are: at roughly 23-year-old in 1993, he was convicted of aggravated burglary. At 28 in 1998, he was convicted of unlawful possession of ammunition. At 31 in 2001, he was convicted of conspiracy to steal lorries. The year after that, in 2002, convicted of inflicting grievous bodily harm, GBH, in an incident that 32-year-old Paul punched an 18-year-old girl in the face, knocking her off her feet and causing a double fracture in her jaw, which required 2 metal plates, which he still has to this day. She was a stranger to him when he punched her in the jaw. Another 3 years on, in 2005, approximately 35-year-old Paul was convicted of heroin possession with the intent to supply. These convictions led to multiple sentences and lengthy spells in jail. As you can imagine, Paul's repeated incarcerations and releases defined much of his adult life. Paul was also a self-styled cage fighting coach and former mixed martial arts (MMA) fighter, and he ran a fitness program under the name Cage Conditioning Coach. Although this being a big part of Paul's life, so he'd claim, he would later state he had only fought in a cage on 2 occasions around 2011. However, an electronic copy of his CV boasted that he was an ex-professional fighter and amateur powerlifter who wanted to become an assessor and verifier. It was in 2005, while doing time for the heroin possession with intent to supply, that saw him incarcerated at HMP Northumberland, which at that time it was actually called HMP Acklington. While at HMP Acklington in 2005, he earned trusted prisoner status and worked in the prison's education department. It was this connection that allowed Caroline to begin a secret affair with Paul. Apparently, this affair wasn't only sexual, and Caroline told Paul she had feelings for him. Now, let's clarify here, Caroline is working in the prison. Paul is an inmate. Not only can Caroline get fired for this intimate relationship, but she can also be sent to prison. And obviously, it's an affair. She's married to another man who works in that prison. So for Caroline, it's vital that this affair had to be kept secret. And it weren't the best kept secret either. There were rumours around the prison and suspicions that Caroline had started this affair, but she obviously continuously lied to cover it up. In fact, her husband, many years later, heard these rumours and asked Caroline about them, but she categorically said no, and she even became upset at these accusations and made a big scene of it to maintain the facade. Eventually, Paul was released from prison, and that put an end to their secret and forbidden relationship. For the next several years, the two of them didn't see each other. They didn't talk. It was completely over. Caroline continued with her life and work. She maintained a marriage publicly and carried on teaching out of prison. However, in 2014, Paul Robson was sentenced once again. This time, he'd been sentenced for 10 years for drug and weapons offences, including another heroin supply charge and possession of a prohibited weapon, which was a stun gun disguised as a mobile phone. Paul would once again serve this sentence in what is now HMP Northumberland. That once again led him to cross paths and reconnect with his old friend Caroline Kayll. Their illicit relationship rekindled once again. By now, Caroline had a decent tenure as a prison educator, and she likely had influence within that department. Paul managed to get some work as a prison cleaner, and apparently Caroline arranged for him to be assigned to the education department for his duties. And obviously that's the department that she's running. This was a clear move to get them to have a lot more opportunities to interact and rekindle their relationship. For about a year, the pair carried on with their revived affair, all while under the nose of the prison authorities and Caroline's husband. Then in 2018, having served just shy of half of his prison sentence, Paul was once again released on licence. He's now about 48-year-old. Caroline's about 45-year-old, and of course Paul's on licence, so he's subject to parole conditions. On being released, Paul had considered moving to Scotland, and he'd lived there before, and he decided he just wanted to settle away from Northumberland. But unlike the last time he was released, this wasn't the end of their illicit affair. Paul and Caroline spent a weekend away together at a converted barn. During that weekend, Caroline apparently told Paul that She'd been diagnosed with cancer, and that changed his mind in regards to moving away. He apparently decided to remain in England and support Caroline, who at this point is still married and with a husband. And at this point, Caroline and Paul's relationship is very different to what it had been in the past. They were now telling each other they loved each other. Apparently 6 months after Paul's release, in late 2018, Caroline made some drastic changes to her life. She left her husband of 13 years so that she could be with Paul. And as I said earlier, Caroline and Ian did remain cordial. There were no harsh words, and they still considered each other as friends after the separation, even meeting up and catching up occasionally. So Caroline, with the separation, moved out of the marital home, temporarily living in a friend's cottage in Linton, a village near Ashington in Northumberland. Of course, her boyfriend Paul, the career criminal, stayed with her a lot during this time, but not before long, he'd effectively moved in with her as her partner. Caroline then went on to buy a house in that small village of Linton, and that became the couple's home. Couple meaning Caroline and Paul, obviously. They lived there in Linton, presenting themselves outwardly as a legitimate couple, despite their unusual origins of their relationship. To neighbours, they were just partners. They were absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. And to be fair, at this point in their lives, that is the truth. Apart from their past, they are now just an ordinary couple. But that isn't all that changed in Caroline's life. She also left the prison service and transitioned into working as a mainstream school teacher. She got a job teaching English at Atkinson House School in Seagill, Northumberland. Now, Atkinson House is a specialist school for children with social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. These are especially vulnerable children. Colleagues and students all knew Caroline as caring and a dedicated educator. And for Caroline, this was great. This new role allowed her to apply her skills in the classroom and continue her apparent lifelong commitment to helping youth. And this time it weren't in the prison environment. She could help youth before they got to that stage. Paul Robson, on the other hand, was still at this point legally on parole. He was portraying himself as a cage fighting instructor or fitness coach within that community. In Caroline's personal life, everything just seemed to flourish for at least a while. She was known to be an avid horse rider. She kept 2 horses at a local farm. She also had a beloved pet, a border terrier dog named Boxer, and this dog was always by her side. Friends recall Caroline found great joy and relaxation in tending to her 2 horses, and she walked her dog throughout the countryside. She owned a pickup truck, which were useful for hauling feed and equipment for her horses. She was proud to have her own home and a vehicle, symbolic of the independent life that she'd once again built. By all appearances, as Caroline entered her mid-40s, she'd got a stable job that she loved, hobbies that she was passionate about, and a partner whom she'd hoped to share the rest of her life with. For this short time, everything was perfect for Caroline once again. She had no current ongoing secrets from a partner or husband, work or the law, or at least that we know of. Life had just got itself into this nice, cushy spot for Caroline. But seriously, all considered, could that really last? How I emphasise that Paul was legally on parole was an important part, because obviously he had conditions, like he had to report to a probation officer periodically, which is a normal condition for anyone on parole. And it was in March 2019, only months after his release, that Paul stopped attending with his probation officer. He basically absconded from supervision. Obviously, that's a breach of his bail conditions, so authorities issued a recall for him to return to prison. But obviously, he didn't hand himself in, so a warrant was issued for his arrest, and he was classed as unlawfully at large. But that didn't really make a difference. Paul managed to evade capture for 20 months, over a year and a half. Almost all of that time, he'd spent living with or near Caroline. Northumbria police would later say that between 2019 and late 2020, they made multiple attempts to locate him. Officers visited his last known address in Wallsend on several occasions, but he was never found there, and neighbours seemingly had absolutely no information regarding his whereabouts. Crucially, police did not know of his relationship with Caroline. There was no information or intelligence linking the two. So Caroline's home was never checked. Caroline was never asked. In hindsight, Paul essentially had been hiding in plain sight with his new partner, who was an ex-police officer, ex-prison officer, and ex-prison educator, and the current teacher, and everything just went on. Caroline's tranquil, happy phase of her life didn't last long. Paul, being a fugitive, was putting an enormous strain on their relationship and on Caroline herself. By 2020, although everything seemed normal and stable, from the outside at least, new troubles were brewing. Her relationship with Paul Robson had begun to deteriorate. They split up in late September, got back together briefly, and then split up again. I mean, who would have thought that a career criminal with a long, violent criminal history, who she met in prison, would turn out to be a bit jealous and controlling? I bet you didn't see that coming. But there is more. There's something you definitely didn't see coming. That's that Caroline and Paul's dynamic worsened significantly when Caroline became involved in yet another inappropriate, illicit, and illegal relationship. And this, by the way, is where I lose every last bit of respect that I may have had for Caroline. Having an affair with an inmate, you can excuse as like a mistake. You could say she fell for him and it were a one-off. But here, at this point in Caroline's story, is where I lose all respect for Caroline. In my opinion, coupled with her illicit affair with Paul, this is totally inexcusable. In 2020, not long after separating from Paul, in fact, it is also suggested later on that it was happening during their relationship, and I do believe that. Anyway, in 2020, Caroline Kayll, now a 47-year-old teacher, initiated a SA relationship with a boy. Yes, I say a boy. He was the teen of 1 and 5. Obviously, his identity has been withheld because of that, and I agree with that, so it should be. Now, it is reported that he was someone that Caroline had met through her work or through the community. He's definitely not a family relation, although it can't be confirmed. It is reported that he was a student at that special needs school where Caroline taught. But again, I want to emphasise that's not confirmed. It's just what I read on one of the sources, and it's quite an obvious link to Mech, to be fair. Caroline would misleadingly tell others that he were a godson, and that was an excuse to explain his frequent presence with her at her house. Now, I'm sorry, but this really pisses me off. In any other circumstances, this would be horrific. The headlines would be 47-year-old teacher, grooms, SA relationship, blah blah blah. But in this case, the press frequently refer to him as her lover. And I'm sorry, he's not her lover, he's her victim. And we can't normalise that, that's not okay. Had this ever gone to court, obviously the trial would have been based on evidence and for the potential grooming and for the SA part of their relationship. But the count 1 could have been SA with one of them, which is a Section 9 offence, and it has a maximum prison sentence of 14 years. If it was penetrative, if it wasn't, it would have been a max sentence of 10 years. Count 2, causing or inciting one of him into engaging in SA, that's Section 10. Basically, if she encouraged, persuaded or manipulated him into SA, that again, 14 years maximum. If it's not penetration, then 10 years maximum. A charge 3 could have been, count 3, could have been SA grooming, Section 15. If she's communicated with him over time to gain trust, normalise that kind of relationship with him, even a single meeting following that type of grooming communication can qualify, and that's a maximum of a 10-year imprisonment. Charge 4 could have been abuse of a position of trust, section 16 to 19, if she was in a position of authority over him, or even a position of care over him, i.e. being a teacher. This significantly aggravates the offence. It adds legal weight, and the court see it as especially serious. There isn't really a minimum or maximum term for that. It's more of a major aggravating factor. In total, a potential sentence would have depended on the amount of charges brought. Likely it would have been more than one. It would have been based on aggravation and mitigation. The aggravation would have been the abuse of trust, the grooming, the emotional harm and effect on that lad, and whether she pleads guilty or not. But it's almost certain that it would have been a custodial sentence. She'd have been behind bars, and it definitely would have been an end to all these careers that she's done in the past, for police, for prison, the schools, the social services. And let's not forget, this isn't Caroline's first offence. She was a prison officer sleeping with an inmate. Maximum 2 years imprisonment, and placed on the offenders register, the S offenders register. And there's the other offences. She's harbouring a fugitive for 20 months. That can be seen as assisting an offender or preventing or perverting the course of justice. That alone can be a 1 to 3 years prison sentence. But yet the media is going, aggravates Caroline. But do pay attention there to the paper exercises. Had she been caught with Paul, either in prison or harbouring him, if any of that had come to light, if she'd been prosecuted, she'd have never been allowed to teach at Atkinson School, Atkinson House School. She'd have never got that job because she wouldn't have passed the DBS checks. She'd have been probably and potentially on the S offenders register. She'd have never ever been anywhere near that school. I'm sorry, far too many articles play down these offences and paint Caroline to be a great person. But fuck that shit. I'm not glossing over it, and I'm very sorry. If you are a family and friends of Caroline's, don't even bother messaging me like it says in the description, because this is one of the very few cases where I'll tell you to do one. I'm presenting the information that I found, and I'm telling you how wrong it is, not only what she's done, but also that the media have glossed over it. This isn't okay, this isn't right, and it needs to stop. It does happen, by the way, far too much, especially with female teachers. Especially in America, to be fair. She may be an amazing person who's done great things for people in need in the community, but she's also took advantage of that position and broke the law 2, 3, maybe 4 times. And the last one is one that I cannot look over or play down or ignore. On with the case. According to Paul, it was when he went to do some work in Leeds in October 2020, and he took one of Caroline's old phones because the screen on his phone had broke. Caroline hadn't signed out of the stuff on this phone, so when he turned it on, all these Facebook messages started to come through and he was getting notifications. That's when I became aware of the relationship between Caroline and the youth. Again, on Paul's account, on the 26th of October, he phoned Caroline and confronted her. At first, she tried to deny it. She tried to say it was just sex. I said, I know about you cheating. I know about you buying cannabis and cocaine. When she said it was just sex, I said, Caroline, you are telling him you love him. She said it's not like that. Paul obviously reacted with fury, but career criminal Paul Robinson also saw it as an opportunity. Bearing in mind, he's on the run. He can't sign on to the dole benefits. He can't get a genuine job. And he's been hurt by someone that he loves and that's supposed to love him. So he came up with an idea. An idea which would get him revenge on Caroline, but also help his financial position on the run. Paul explicitly leveraged Caroline's fear of public shame and legal consequences for doing what she'd been doing. Obviously, Caroline was desperate to keep the situation quiet. She didn't want to lose her career or go to jail, let alone tarnish her amazing reputation. So it was way too easy for Paul to blackmail her. Caroline's life, which had been going so brilliantly well for her lately, had just shattered into a million pieces. At the end of October, there was a burglary at Caroline's home. She told a male friend of hers that jewellery had been taken. With the help of a friend, she changed the locks at her house. She confided in this friend in the days and weeks after Paul and her had split up. Caroline said that Paul Robson was being difficult and unpleasant. She told this friend that Paul was blackmailing her. She mentioned a figure of £35,000. Caroline showed him some pictures of the youth, saying he was 18. But her friend thought he looked younger. She showed him some of the messages from Paul. He had said that he was going to ruin her. Over a span of just 10 days, Caroline drained her finances to try and keep Paul silent. She transferred approximately £29,000 to Paul, and when her savings had run out, she then took out a loan for £10,500 to raise extra cash for him. Prior to this, Caroline had been financially stable, owning her own property, maintaining healthy savings, but this extortion had flipped that upside down. It emptied her accounts and placed her into debt. But selling his silence for money didn't quite give him enough sense of revenge. It didn't quell his anger or satisfy him. Money wasn't enough for Paul. Paul's jealousy and rage continued to escalate despite the payoffs. And in mid-November 2020, the situation reached a breaking point. Paul sent messages to a former neighbour, Caroline's current neighbour. The messages were ranting about Caroline's relationship with the lad and indicating that he was losing his rag over it. It became clear that Paul wanted to hurt Caroline physically. By this point, with Caroline and Paul's relationship over, Paul had retreated to Scotland, and that's where he planned his attack. In the afternoon of Sunday the 15th of November 2020, Paul went to Homebase, a hardware store, and bought 2 bottles of ammonia for £6.50. In a separate transaction, he then bought a wrench, pliers and a screwdriver set for £32. He also bought several knives, including scissors, a kitchen knife and a meat cleaver, a locksmith's jemmy bar and a magnetic GPS tracker. He filled a spray bottle up with the ammonia cleaning solution, which is a caustic liquid. Then, armed with the makeshift arsenal, wearing steel toe-cap work boots, he drove roughly 3 hours from Glasgow down to Linton in Northumberland, heading straight to Caroline's home. Now, maybe it's just me, but it seems only logical in Caroline's position to assume that she'd ended the illegal relationship that she was in. But no. In fact, Caroline had no intention of ending it. While Paul was gathering this armoury, Caroline was having a bit of trouble with her victim. They'd fallen out because he'd found out that Caroline was going for a walk with another man. In a message, he called her a daft cunt. I'll read you some of the messages from that day. If I had anything to hide, you would not have access to my phone. I spend all my time with you. It's you I want to spend time with, no one else. He's a friend. I've not seen him since I left for prison. I've known him 22 years, and his wife had just died last year from cancer. I was being a friend, that's all. It's you I want. He replied, "Fuck off, you lying cunt." I'm not lying. I'm not. Don't do this. I know you're annoyed. I've got male threats, but that's all they are. I've told you how I feel about you. It's only you. You know that. The youth replied, "Fuck off." Caroline said, "Please don't. I love you." He said, "No you don't," and goes on to tell her to just have your date. She replies, "You're wrong. It was a walk with a friend who just lost his wife. I told you. I've nothing to hide from you. Please don't do this. It's you I want to be with. No one else. I want to be with you. I love being with you." He replied, "Aye, believe you loads." She added, "I want you. I'm breaking my heart here. Please," youth's name. She has to meet him, and he tells her, "Go have your date." She repeats that there is no one else and that she loves him and she wants to be with him. She adds, "I'm fucking telling you, I want you. Please, I want you." Aim, in his great blunt messages, puts, "Don't believe you." So she replies, "Let me prove it to you." He says, "You don't need to prove nothing." The persistent predator, Caroline, then goes on to say, "Please meet me for 10 minutes. I love you. I love the bones of you. I adore you. You know I love you." The youth goes on to tell her, "Love someone else." And again she replies, telling him she wants him. She adds, "I want to be with you, no one else. I worship you. You know I do." At 3 minutes to 4 that afternoon, CCTV shows Caroline and the youth arrive on her street in her car. Just over an hour later, they once again leave. 10 minutes later, she's seen putting diesel into a pickup truck at a local Asda in Ashington. Footage then shows Caroline and the youth arrive back at her house in Foxcover, Linton, in her car at 10 to 7 that night. It was 1 hour and 15 minutes later, at 5 minutes past 8, that Paul arrived at Caroline's house and is seen in various pieces of CCTV footage prowling and moving around her house. 16 minutes later, at 21 minutes past 8, he goes through the back garden gate. Some 24 minutes after he went through that gate, Paul is then seen coming out of the front door of Caroline's house. Soon after he'd entered through that back gate, through the back door of Caroline's house, a neighbour heard a woman's voice shouting, "Get out!" What happened next was a prolonged and vicious assault against both Caroline and the lad. In his rage, Paul first set upon Caroline. Once he'd somehow forced her to the floor, he kicked her in the head and face repeatedly with his steel toe-cap boots. That inflicted devastating blows. It's also thought that he strangled her and slashed her with a blade. He also cut her hair. Clumps of Caroline's hair were later found all over the place. She suffered deep cuts on her body, including slashes to her bum and her thighs. Her clothes were pretty much ripped to shreds. Of course, the lad tried to intervene, but Paul turned on him as well, stabbing and slashing the boy with scissors, then a knife, and then the meat cleaver. Both Caroline and the lad were doused with the ammonia, including in their wounds and their faces. Now, ammonia is a corrosive liquid, which caused them chemical burns and obviously additional pain. The kicks to Caroline's face were so ferocious that they fractured her facial bones, fractured her skull, and caused traumatic brain injury. The injuries were so severe, Caroline went into cardiac arrest, which were mainly caused from the head trauma. The youth suffered at least 45 separate injuries in the frenzied attack, some of which were defensive as he tried to shield himself and grab the blade in desperation. He suffered 29 distinct wounds across his body. Paul had struck him so hard in the face with the cleaver that it fractured the boy's sinus bone. Paul had also bit the lad 4 times. In all, this was a prolonged, brutal assault on both victims. Early on in this attack, Paul had stole both of their mobile phones to prevent them calling for help. He'd also tore out the landline so that neither of them could phone for help, and he even went to the extent of changing the lad's PIN so he couldn't access it. And he also removed both phones' SIM cards. This was to ensure that they had no easy way to contact emergency services, effectively trapping them in the situation. But there's a quick tip here. You can call 999 without a SIM card. As long as your phone connects to a cell tower, you could still connect to 999 or your local emergency services without a SIM card. You can also call emergency services without the PIN number on your phone. On almost all phones, including iPhones and Android, when you go to the unlock screen where it shows you a pattern of a PIN, at the bottom it says emergency. Press it and you will be able to call for 999 or whatever your local number is. However, in this situation, that wouldn't have helped because Paul removed their phones and his weapons from the house when he left. He discarded of all his weapons and all of his bloodstained clothes on his way to leaving. But he kept the mobile phones because he was going to need them later on. But when Paul left, he didn't simply just run and continue hiding from the police. He actually knocked on the neighbour's door. Bearing in mind, these neighbours used to be a neighbour of Paul as well because he lived there. When they answered, he told them Caroline is in a bad way inside the house. I believe he even went round with the neighbour to Caroline's house and showed her what had happened. And then obviously he fled the scene. This neighbour was an off-duty nurse, so she rushed over to Caroline's home and discovered the very gruesome, messy scene. She described, there was blood and hair everywhere. I could see Caroline lying face down on the floor. She was not breathing. Her clothes were ripped. Her leggings were pulled down to her knees. Her briefs were intact. She had a cut across her bottom, and the teenage boy was cowering in shock and vomiting in blood. Emergency services were called to Caroline's address on Fox Cover, Linton, at 5 minutes to 9. They were responding to reports of a disturbance and an assault. The neighbour did her best to administer aid. She performed CPR on Caroline until the paramedics arrived. When they did, both victims were obviously gravely injured. Caroline was rushed to Newcastle Hospital and placed on life support. But despite their best efforts, her injuries were too severe to survive. 2 days later, on the 17th of November, at midday, Caroline was declared to be clinically and neurologically dead. She died in the hospital 2 days later, on the 19th of November 2020, when her life support machines were turned off. Her cause of death was catastrophic brain damage. A toxicology test revealed that it is likely she had taken cocaine in the recent past, but it was not likely that she was under the influence at the time of the attack. Caroline had fractures to both cheekbones and a maxillary bone in the front of her cheek. There was also fractures to the bones that make up the floor in her eye socket and multiple fractures to her nasal bones. She had fractures on her ribs, but it's claimed that they were likely caused by the resuscitation attempts. Caroline also had bruising to muscles in her neck and on her left arm. Her left bum cheek had a 170mm scratch with 4 parallel scratches. Her right bum cheek had a 80mm long cut, which was 20mm deep. There were scabbed grazes on Caroline's cheek, bruising to her neck and ear, a tear in the skin at the back of her head, and a scratch to her chest just above her left breast. Jurors were told that there were also multiple areas of bruising on Caroline's arm, elbow, wrist, hand and shoulder. She had bruising behind her ear and on the neck, a split in the skin where her ear attaches to the head, and there was bruising from her right temple all the way down to her jaw, with grazes, abrasions and scratches. There was bruising and grazing to her eyelids, bruising on the nose, forehead, and the whole left side of her face was also bruised. The brain had twisted violently inside of her head, causing fibre damage. In all, Caroline had 60 injuries. The boy, despite his many injuries, included severe lacerations, a broken bone, chemical burns. He miraculously survived. He was hospitalised, treated and later discharged with no life-threatening injuries. However, he would later require surgery and experience significant psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder and flashbacks, as a result of that night of terror. Having reported Caroline needing help to a neighbour, Paul then fled all the way back to Scotland. The next footage of Paul is of him at a Shell petrol station north of Carlisle, where he refuels his car and then is seen looking at phone chargers in the petrol station shop. It's claimed he was looking for chargers for Caroline and the lad's phone, but he later denied that. he was just casually looking at phone charges. About 3-4 hours after the attack, at 10 minutes past midnight, Caroline's SIM card was put into Paul's phone before being swapped into a different handset later on. Paul used it to send messages to Caroline's neighbour, saying, "Is she okay?" neighbour's name. Caroline's violent death shocked the local community and made national headlines. Obviously, because of the nature of Paul and Caroline's relationship, and then him being a fugitive, not many people knew about their relationship at all. But luckily, Caroline had told some friends, so it weren't too much of an investigation to uncover who the prime suspect should be. So police quickly named 50-year-old Paul Robson as the prime suspect. And subsequently, Northumbria police launched a manhunt, warning the public that he was dangerous. However, he would remain at large for another 5 days. And he used those 5 days to attack Caroline's name and bring to light what she'd been doing. On the 16th of November, the day after Caroline had been attacked, as she laid injured on life support, her estranged husband received an email from her email account. Attached in the email was a screenshot of the conversation from Caroline's phone, which included a message that says, "Still having naughty thoughts about you. Sorry." The text of the email simply said, "He is teen 15 old," and she sends that. On receiving this email, obviously Caroline's estranged husband didn't know who'd sent it or who the conversation in the screenshot was between. But knowing that it was suggestively not right, he forwarded the email to the police. Family and friends also saw the screenshots of intimate conversations between Caroline and the lad because Paul had posted them onto her Facebook account. The same day, he is also seen on CCTV at a cash point trying to take another £500 out of Caroline's account with her bank card. At some point, Paul had also made 4 transactions of £4,000 each to different people with notes saying, "Keep this for me, hold this, keep this for me, keep that for me." On the 19th of November, 4 days after the attack, the Ford Fiesta that Paul had used on that day was found in Glasgow. There was blood on the steering wheel and the driver's door panel and the accelerator pedal. The tools which he'd bought from home base but had not used were still in the boot. Finally, on Friday the 20th of November 2020, the day after Caroline's life support machine had been turned off, Paul was tracked down and arrested outside of Glasgow in Scotland. He was brought back to England to face justice. There is some footage of Paul in the police station in the early hours of the 21st. I'll show you that now, but basically he's kicking off because they refused to give him his glasses, like facial glasses.
He likes his speaks. Paul, you can't have your...
Get them, right? You can't have them. I don't think I'm some fucking I've been here before. You can't have them.
Paul,
we're
seizing them. That's the problem. We can't
give you
well,
you're allowed them. If you wait, I'm going to belt and I'm going nowhere, alright? Stand up for a minute. Listen, I'm telling you, I'm just going to explain to you, your spectacles can't be given back to you. Why? Because they've been seized. And? It's evidential purposes, so they can't be given back to you for simple as that. Put your hands off. You're going to be getting... Put your hands on me now, put your hands on you. Right, that's fine, but you're going to be getting cuffed one way or the other, okay? We're from North America. I want to say, Sergeant, I want to say...
It's just here.
Why? I'm going to put my hands on you and you're going to be getting cuffed. You just wait until I spoke to him. You wait. That's what's going to happen, okay? Why can't I get my glasses? You're in charge.
They've been seized, evidential purposes, okay? Yeah, so
who do I see?
Who do you see?
Who do I see? I need my glasses.
Right.
I can't see I can barely see you.
Right, mate.
My balance is off. I've got blind and migraine. So you tell me.
We're here to look after you.
Right. I'm not being looked after.
Well, you have been. Yeah.
You're coming now, you're just shoveling me off.
Well, we're not.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, you are.
You'll
reveal the scene there is when you get to custody.
No. I'm asking the sergeant.
Right, well, he's explained to you.
No, he hasn't explained this. I'm finished.
Right.
Don't get a little lippy with me, in front of these.
Okay,
right?
I'm just telling you what's happening.
So tell me what do I do now?
You will get assessed by a nurse when you get to custody in England.
In England.
Yeah.
And then I ask them, so I start this road. Listen, I know these better than you. I'll get nowhere. Come on, get them on.
That's your hands here. Just to the rear, mate. Thank you very much. Happy?
How do they feel?
So,
Tight?
Then I can tip my finger through the hole, so you got plenty of room.
Never mind that, that's
Oh, no, there you go. Right.
No.
Right, Paul, obviously I'm going to arrest you now, okay? So you've been arrested for the murder of Caroline Kayll and the attempt murder of on the 15th of November 2020 at 8 in cover in Linton. Alright, so you do not have to say anything but make harm offence if you do not mention questions subsequent to later line in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence, alright?
Appreciate you being in here, alright?
Happy?
Paul refused to answer the police questions, but he did give a prepared statement in which he denied killing Caroline and claimed that he was a victim of the attack. It said, "When I heard about Caroline's death, I intended to arrange surrender to the police. I am emotionally spent. I am finding it very difficult to concentrate. I never intended to kill anyone. I cannot believe Caroline is dead. I cannot believe she is gone. This is like a nightmare, like a bad dream. I cannot believe she's not here. I am so tired and I am devastated." Paul said he'd been at her house that night and they'd argued before he was hit from behind, causing him to fall. I recall feeling something around my throat. I was feeling all sorts of emotions. I remember being dazed and feeling sick and scared. I just felt like everything was unravelling. I may have asked for help. I just cannot clearly recall at this stage. When I learned Caroline was dead, I contacted my solicitor. I feel broken. My solicitor has arranged for me to be assessed by a psychiatrist. I wish to be assessed as soon as possible to allow me to make sense of what has happened here. In all the circumstances, I am not in a position to sensibly answer any questions. Paul's entire defence was that it was the lad who had attacked Caroline and Paul, and Paul had just acted in self-defence when inflicting injuries on to the lad. And obviously the lad was also interviewed. I believe it was more of a victim and a witness, not as a suspect, but I don't know for certain. Anyway, he said that he was in an upstairs bedroom about to have a cigarette when a man, who was a stranger to him, came in, jumped on his back and stabbed him. The boy later told police how Paul didn't say a word as he carried out the brutal assault. He gets scissors and comes into the room, and he was on my back and not saying anything. I said, "Whoa, what's this about?" He was on my back. He's kind of heavy. Took hold of my shoulders and stabbed me. He's holding me with one hand and stabbing me with the other. I was fighting with him. I was saying, "Whoa." He gets up and says, "Don't move or I'll kill you." He then came back with a bigger blade. A 7-inch blade. I have seen it in the kitchen drawer. He stabbed me in the back and stabbed me a few times in the struggle. The teen said he suffered a deep cut to his left hand as he tried to prevent Paul from stabbing him further. He went on, he said, "Come down," and we went down and Caroline's on the floor at the back door. I went in the kitchen because I was covered in blood. I went straight to the tap and he cuts her hair off. He was cutting her hair with scissors. She wasn't responding. He came into the kitchen and gets a cleaver from the kitchen drawer and he hits me in the head, twice with the cleaver. I was dizzy. I couldn't really stand up. He got a garden hose and sprayed her in the face. In the aftermath, the full story of Caroline Kayll's life and the events leading up to her death came to light through the court proceedings. At Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutors presented the disturbing details of the case, and Paul eventually stood trial for murder, attempted murder, and blackmail in early 2021. Caroline Kayll's family, including her ex-husband, sat through the trial, and so did the teen victim and his family. Paul's defence said he chased the lad who ran up the stairs. He, the teen, was raging, calling Caroline a liar and a cunt, and he was trying to stab Paul. At one point he stabbed with such force, his hand slipped down the hill onto the blade. The statement went on to say that Paul managed to disarm the lad, but the lad was in a rage, and he forced him out of the ensuite bathroom into the bedroom, and that he ended up on top of Paul and was saying, "She's a fucking liar." He was intent on driving the scissors into Paul's face. Paul had bit him and managed to wrestle the scissors from him. He accepted stabbing him a number of times to subdue him. Paul dragged him downstairs. He then went to Caroline Kayll and realised a lot of her hair had been cut off. Paul attempted mouth-to-mouth, but her mouth was full of blood. He sprayed her face with a hose to clear away hair and was washing away the blood. He tried mouth-to-mouth and put her in the recovery position. Paul then claimed that he came at him again with the meat cleaver, but he got the better of him and disarmed him. He accepts that he struck the lad a number of times with the knife, but insisted he inflicted the injuries with lawful self-defence. However, forensic evidence, witness accounts and neighbours hearing Caroline screaming in distress, the CCTV footage, the pattern of injuries, all pointed to Paul being the assailant. The judge remarked that the attack on Caroline and the boy was one of the most violent crimes he'd ever encountered. Jurors were so shaken by the harrowing testimonies and the images that the judge excused the jury from further jury service for at least a decade. Obviously, the jury did not believe Paul's lies, and on March 2021, Paul Robson was found guilty of Caroline Kayll's murder and the attempted murder of the teen lad, as well as blackmail. The aggravating factors for this sentence were significant premeditation. Robson drove 2.5 hours, 3 hours from Glasgow to Linton with the intention of a violent confrontation, carrying a pre-fashioned weapon and prowling outside of a house. The DA context of the murder. It had occurred in the home that Paul and Caroline had once shared, exposing the trust inherent in their former relationship. The extreme violence, inflicting additional unnecessary violence on Caroline as she lay dying, such as slashing a bum with a knife or meat cleaver. Being unlawfully at large, because Paul was unlicensed and unlawfully at large, having been recalled to prison on the 1st of March 2019 for his breach of licence. Paul's extensive criminal record, a history of 91 offences over 30 years, which included violent and weapon-related crimes, such as aggravated burglary and grievous bodily harm, concealment of evidence, deliberately disposing of the weapons, the victim's phones, and his clothing and phones. The false defence. He tried to get away with it by blaming the boy. The use of ammonia as a weapon, a particularly dangerous and cruel method of attack used on both victims. Attack on a vulnerable... Yeah, you get what I'm saying there. The use of a series of different bladed weapons in a sustained frenzied attack on a teen 1-5. The nature of the blackmail. That's also a major aggravating factor. There was no mitigating factors though. So on the 31st of March 2021, Paul Robson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before he can even be considered for parole. He also got concurrent sentences for the attempted murder and for the blackmail. In all, if Paul Robson does ever get out of prison, he will be at least 85-year-old. Later on in August 2021, the judge ordered a confiscation order under the Proceeds of Crime Act, compelling Paul to repay £10,343.92, which is the remaining amount traceable from the money it extorted from Caroline Kayll. Now this is where I usually pay respect to the victim, but wow, this case has given me such an existential crisis. But I do think my current stance on this case is the same as it was when I started. You see, all the tributes said that Caroline was dedicated in her life to helping people, and that's a great, noble pursuit. However, the reason you can't sleep with an inmate is because it's legally seen as an abuse of power, an abuse of your position of trust. And let's face it, it also undermines the sentence. But skipping over the bit where she harboured a fugitive. I mean, Paul Robson was a career criminal and he did really bad things, Yet the fact that she harboured him is the least bad thing she did, in my opinion, says a lot that we can just skip over it. But skipping over that, she then once again does the abuse of position of trust. But this time it's with someone who isn't of legal. Sure, you can argue in the UK they would have been legal when they were 16, it's only a year off. But for fuck's sake, she's 30 years older than him and potentially his teacher. So the existential crisis part is the question of, is she a good person for the things that she did? A bad person for the things that she did, or a good person who did some bad things, made some mistakes? And in my opinion, it's the second. Especially because all the good things she did, or the bad things she did, were linked. Her good things were helping vulnerable people in the community, and the bad things were taking advantage of those exact people and that exact position. And I'm sure many of you are wondering the same thing I am. She had a prolonged affair with an inmate twice, 7 years apart, without ever getting caught. How can we possibly rule out that there isn't more? You know, that being said, I have to remain unbiased, especially where the information is involved. So here is some things, some statements, some of which have been made before the full details of the case were brought to light. It's important that you know that bit. The prosecution acknowledged that she had made some life choices not all of us would make, and that those who knew Caroline also emphasised that these mistakes don't define the entirety of her life. Tributes poured in from colleagues, neighbours and students in the days after her death, painting a picture of a compassionate teacher and friend. Community members described her as a lovely lady and an amazing person who had touched many lives for the better. At Atkinson House School, staff and pupils mourned the loss of an educator who had been dedicated to the children with special needs. Her former social work and police colleagues remembered her commitment to public service in her early years. And that's about it. So now I just need to point out that I don't condone violence. I am not saying she deserved what happened. That is not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is I refuse to stand back, like the media have, and gloss over these really bad things that she's done like it doesn't matter. She deserved to be in prison, is what she deserved. But it's important you understand that I am not saying that I'm okay with what's happened. I'm not saying I'm glad. I'm not saying any of that. Of course I'm not. What I am saying is I cannot stand here and do what the media have done and gone, yeah, but she was great and she got murdered and she was great. No, I'm telling you, this is the information, and I'm saying that I don't think it's okay that we've just ignored all the bad things she's done, all the illegal things she's done, just so that we can make her look good in a story. Yes, it's not okay what's happened to her. Of course, it's not okay what's happened to her. But I'm not going to paint her as a saint. The only victim that I would really, really like to pay tribute to is the young lad, because he is a victim from the very start of this case to the very end of it, or from the start of where he comes into his case. And I can only imagine being involved in this violent act is bad enough for your mental health going forward, but what Caroline were doing as well can also be a really hard thing to get over. It can, big trust issues and everything else. So the two of them things and crescendoing like it did, wow, that has got to be some really hard going. And I feel so sorry for him. I hope he is okay. He should be about 20 now. I hope he's recovered and he's getting on with his life. And I hope he's in a good place. And I actually, as I was finishing writing this, I did think it would be really great if the proceeds of crime, all the money that came back from the extortion, actually went to him. Not so much in the form of money, but in the funding of education or something like that. But I think that's the least the system can do for this poor lad. That being said, I'm going. Please do keep a very close eye, because this video will be out soon. I don't know what order I'm going to do them in. This video might be out in mid-June. It also might be out. This video will be out, it should be out at end of June. But there's also a chance it will be mid-July, because I am that close to getting a video a fortnight out. So if you're watching this at end of June, do watch out, because in mid-July, we might start having mid-month videos. All I'm saying is, I love you. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. And I'll see you real soon. Bye. I've just covered the microphone. Bye.